welcome to New York City. You know, I sat in on one of the seminars that we had take place earlier today. It's very interesting. The guy teaching it referred to Clay Christensen in a recent book about the attributes of innovative leaders, and he very briefly summarized the four attributes. And one of them was that innovative leaders are highly networked. And in case you haven't noticed, you're in a network. And we're really glad you're here and forming and building and keeping this network strong, because it is, in fact, of course, how, as a community, we learn together and get better. And I tell you the other three attributes, but one of the attributes of old leaders is they can't remember anything. So if you are interested in the other three, I have to. We have a plethora of fellows with us today. And I'd like to begin by introducing the League's two current orchestra management fellows. They are Agnieszka Rakhmatulayev and Estell. And I ask both of you to stand so we can all recognize you. They both began their fellowship here at Aspen last summer, and Agnieszka is now at the San Francisco Symphony, and then she'll move on to the North Carolina Symphony. And Eska is with the Chicago Symphony, and then she'll go to the Pacific Symphony. And they are taking everything in with great gusto, and we're thrilled that they're joining us for today and tomorrow's meetings. Now, that's not all. The fellows front. We also welcome today the DeVos Fellows from the Kennedy Center's Arts Management Program, who are observing today. And they are William Morris, Veronika Schmitz, Darren Rich, and Jeff Collier. And we ask you to stand so we can recognize you. And I assume everyone else here is either a former fellow or a fellow who's never been a fellow. Thanks to all of you. Today's reception, which comes right after this plenary session, is sponsored again by our very good friends at the Corporation for International Business, and they're represented here today by President and CEO Kurt Wilson and Lead Manager for Customer Service and Sales, Representative Jackie Daggich. Tomorrow morning's coffee service has been generously sponsored again this year by Shalino Artist Management, represented here today by their Executive Director, Marianne Shalino, and Associate Molly Allred. And we're also happy to be joined today by Richard Tulaski, President and Principal Acquisition for Tulaski, who continues to generously sponsor the name badges you are wearing and at all the events. Let's thank all of our sponsors. I don't think many of us are sorry to leave 2012 behind. The final weeks of the year were filled with tragedy, especially here in the Northeast. Hurricane Sandy and Newtown, Connecticut are horrific reminders of how much work lies ahead for America in dealing with the natural and man-made disasters. And in those very same December weeks, our Congress was considering plans to dramatically limit tax incentives for charitable giving. Proposed changes would have directly hurt the nonprofit sector, the sector whose sole purpose is to serve the public interest by helping us cope with and rise to our challenges. In our own world, a small but significant group of orchestras have encountered disruptions of service and major concessionary contracts. While each of these situations is unique, they are all wrestling with the new realities of our changing world. But for all the challenges we face in our field and as a nation, we have equal cause to celebrate and embrace America today. And that's because technology, innovation, and our ever-changing population present boundless opportunity for growth in our democracy, in our organizations, and in our creative lives. And I want to underscore that we, the people working in orchestras, are a part of this wider world. We're both influenced by it and capable of influencing it. We can rightfully take pride in the wordless yet exquisite power of our performances to bind, to comfort, and challenge our audiences. And our influence was recently felt in Washington, where as a community we stood firmly shoulder to shoulder with our nonprofit partners in social service, education, and healthcare, to preserve the charitable deduction in the fiscal cliff deal, recognizing that we all need and depend on one another. Our voices were heard in Congress and in the administration. The outcome of the year-end budget negotiations was actually far less onerous than any of us had anticipated. But as Heather Noonan, our fearless leader in Washington, has let us know, there is much, much more to do as we anticipate comprehensive tax reform in the spring. And I would add that there's also much, much more work for us to do as we continue turning outward toward our communities. All of your communities are the same in that they are all made up of different kinds of people. The specific differences, of course, vary from place to place. We know from social scientists, from urban planners, educational theorists, all alike, that when people of difference encounter one another, they change, they're stimulated, they grow, they find better solutions. But let's face it, orchestras have been slow to recognize and act on this idea. And we paid a price. For example, last year's report commissioned by the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy called on foundations to redistribute monies away from orchestras, ballet, and opera and toward culturally specific organizations. That report continues to enjoy a very robust circulation and discussion in the foundation community. But we also know that there's an emerging imperative among orchestras to become authentic partners with their communities. I'm especially amazed and delighted when I see and hear the creative work taking place on orchestra stages, designed to make many different kinds of people find a point of connection to our unique musical experience. The orchestral experience is at our core, it's what we know and what we do best. The League continues to provide resources to help and support this growing momentum in orchestras toward deeper engagement with their communities. We're really pleased to have awarded grants totaling $425,000 to 22 orchestras through the Getty Education Community Investment Program earlier this year. This re-granting program will continue for another 2 cycles, and hopefully we'll be able to renew the 3-year gift from the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation. And be on the lookout for the next announcement of application information. And meanwhile, feel free to speak to Polly or Jessica if you have any questions. The League has also reinvigorated its commitment to fostering diversity and inclusion in our field. But we started first with our board, and we believe that until the League itself could begin to come to grips and tackle this very challenging issue, we really weren't sufficiently positioned to develop work for our members. And so we began with some board conversations about diversity, and a very simple question, but a hard one to answer: what do we mean by diversity? And those conversations with our board were tough, they were revealing, but they were extremely helpful in beginning to coalesce within the board and the senior staff a point of view and a sense of direction around how the League itself could become more diverse and inclusive, and then how we could be of help to our member orchestras. One of the things we began working on was a tool developed by BoardSource called Diversity in Action Assessment. It's an online survey that enables boards to identify their current diversity and inclusion practices and to determine whether those are creating barriers to expanding their diversity. They found this survey offered a fresh and timely context for examining these complex issues. And since then, we've been able to identify a number of steps forward for the League and for the field. Today's plenary session is one of those steps. We also have just gone live with the new Diversity and Inclusion Resource Center. This online site is designed to provide League members, as a benefit of membership, with a range of resources on diversity and inclusion that are especially selected for their relevance to orchestras. These resources are categorized by topic, and they include best practices in orchestras and other arts organizations, best practices in other fields, the business case for diversity and inclusion, board resources, management resources, and various readings and publications and research. The board self-assessment tool I mentioned is on this site. So is BoardSource's Diversity in Action ebook, which provides tools to help your board and staff increase diversity and adopt inclusive policies. I do hope you'll visit the website. It's at AmericanOrchestras.org. Now, while we strongly encourage your deepening work in diversity and inclusion, we also make the case to many stakeholders that orchestras are, in fact, making important progress in this area. I make a point of sharing this news in my frequent conversations with the press, and my recent blog on Huffington Post speaks directly to this issue. And by the way, I was recently invited by the Huffington Post to become a regular blogger, and this represents an important opportunity for our field. The site's a major forum for arts and culture, but when it comes to orchestras, it has regrettably been engaged mostly in finger pointing and the blame game. In fact, I was at the receiving end of one of those finger points when I was called on the Huffington Post the zombie overlord of all the symphony orchestras. Me, who would have thunk it? Anyhow, now I have a chance to get back. So, you know, the strength of our message will be measured in numbers of eyeballs, and so please pass on any of these posts if you like what you read. Our strength also will be measured by the seriousness with which orchestras pursue these important actions. So, today we want to use this time together to grow and deepen our work in diversity and inclusion. We have two special guests. One will help us look outward at the demographics of the electorate in 2012 and what they mean for us looking forward. And the other will help us look inward at our mental models and unconscious biases. And following these two presentations, you'll have some time for discussion at your tables to pose questions to our guests. So, it's my great pleasure to now introduce you to Anita, Estell, and Bo Young Lee. They're both right there. Anita, who's going to start first, is considered to be one of Washington, D.C.'s outstanding policy experts. She served as Chief of Staff to Dr. Jonetta B. Cole on the Clinton Ford transition team, and as Senior Advisor to Education Secretary Richard Riley, where she coordinated the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. As staff to the House Appropriations Committee, she managed bills that authorized more than $1 trillion in federal programs. And so, I'm going to say a couple of words about Bo, and then we'll get started with Anita. Bo Young is the Global Diversity and Inclusion Practice Leader for the firm Diversity Best Practices. With over 15 years of experience as an internal diversity leader and as a consultant, she's helped clients like John Hancock, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, John Deere, Pfizer, Boston Scientific, and Marriott International launch and facilitate diversity leadership councils, build metrics, diversity scorecards, and accountability models, and embed diversity and inclusion into broad HR processes, including performance. Anita's going to lead things off, and when she's finished, she's going to hand the baton to Bo. And then we'll invite you to spend a few minutes talking with colleagues around the two questions you'll find at your tables. And those questions are, what did you hear today that might imply new actions to take to your own orchestra, and what questions do you have for Anita and Bo? And then at the end, we'll invite you to share your questions or comments with Anita and Bo and all your colleagues in the room. So, without further ado, Anita, take it away.
I feel like I gave Jesse the hook. Sorry about that, Jesse. He just shared some profoundly relevant remarks, so let's give him a hand for being a great team. You guys have to bear with me. I'm still a little hungover from last week's inauguration festivities. I had like 12 people spending the night in my home for days. So I'm finally recovering. And most of them were from New York. What a pleasure to be here. I want to acknowledge Jesse. I also like to thank Heather Noonan, Polly Khan, and Jessica Balboni, and also my co-presenter, Bo Young Lee, for all the good conversations we've had and getting up to this point. I'm going to talk about the new majority, America's changing, and the changing demographics. As background, I do have extensive experience on appropriations, working for Bill Clinton, Secretary of Education, Dick Wiley, Lou Stokes from Cleveland, Ohio, if there are any people from Cleveland here. I've worked with Detroit, all kinds of people across the country. And I'm just amazed at what I'm seeing on the landscape of America right now. And I'd like to talk with you about it just a little bit. So as an overview, we'll talk about the relevance of the new majority and changing demographics, the states that delivered the Electoral College affirmations and surprises, and how this affects diversity in the 113th Congress, potential meaningful questions for the orchestra community as a result of these developments, seemingly insurmountable dream realized. Here we'll talk about a little bit about the vision that Reverend Martin Luther King demonstrated and what it may mean for the orchestral community. The power of clear vision, what that means for your community. And then a final thought, change is certain. These photos demonstrate some of the changing diversity and the impact that it had on the election. You can see the color, you can see the texture of who we are, the gender. You can even see the language implications and how they played out and making sure that people had a place. All of these are polling stations. More specifically, what we know about the changing demographics is that it looks like what I call the rainbow coalition remix. You have women, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and what we call the young or the millennials. If you look at the number in terms of the relevance of the new majority, you'll see that in terms of gender, 55% of women voted for President Obama. This number represents single white women mainly. The married white women voted for Romney, interestingly. You see by race, you have the black vote, 93% Hispanic, and you see education, non-college graduates and college graduates leaning toward Obama. The age, people under 45 voted with the president, 45 and older went with Mr. Romney, and then also by income, people who made less than $50,000 a year. And these are the people that are increasingly comprising the new America, the face of new America. So even more specifically, you'll see that according to Gallup, the gender gap in 2012 election was the largest since the company began tracking the metric in 1952 by approximately 20 points, with Obama winning women by 12% and Romney winning men by 8%. Age and ethnicity, baby boomers and millennials contrasted dramatically in 2012. Again, he won 60% of the 18 to 29-year-old, while Governor Romney won 60% of voters 45 to 64 and older. Now, this is the real important part right here. Approximately 40% of millennials are non-white, and that number is rising in the following generation. While Americans older than 50 are currently approximately 76% white. So, and that number will drop as the millennials were older. Of course, those who are now elderly will start to die and move on, which has real implications for your community. Because the question is, who's going to be your performers, your administrators, and who are going to be your benefactors? And if the older white population starts to die off, as the younger, more diverse communities start to claim the majority, to what extent are we going to be able to involve with the activities of your community? And so by 2050, you'll see that 47% of the United States population will be white. In terms of economic inequality, you've heard from filmmaker Michael Moore. In 2009, he reported that the bottom 60% of US households owned only 2.3% of total US wealth. And I've corroborated and confirmed this data with other sources. So that's about $1.22 trillion. And if you look at the numbers, this amount is less than the estimated combined net worth of the individuals on the Forbes 400 list. That's really quite awful. Wouldn't you agree? I can't hear you. Wouldn't you? I'm engaging in this conversation. Let me just take a moment and let you know. I'm engaging in this conversation as a presenter, but I'm also engaging in this conversation as a stakeholder and a concerned citizen. That's why I'm here. And these numbers are to bring home a point, but they're also here to outline exactly the type of work that you and I have to do as the gatekeepers of this generation to turn this situation around. So I'm going to be calling on you for your input and your response, because if we don't get it together, who will, right? So that's why these numbers are here. It's not some cold, objective data that doesn't touch our realities in our lives. These numbers affect us. These trends affect us. And as leaders and stakeholders, I think we've got to roll up our sleeves and get busy. If you look at the middle class, President Obama really paid attention to this demographic. Those people 30,000 to 100,000 annually. And he won this group by 51%. And the chart below shows that this demographic has been really important to the party winning elections. But again, we know that it's most of the people, it's a good number of the people what Governor Romney called for 47%. The battleground states. It was interesting, President Obama won 10 of these 11 states. No one thought he was going to do this, but he really used his resources and targeted these communities. Colorado, Florida, Iowa, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin. The only state that he won, the only one that he lost rather, was North Carolina. And just for the record, I'm neither a fan of the president necessarily, I'm a fan of the process. I'm a fan of freedom and democracy, so just for the record. Diversity in the 113th Congress. What we have now is 21 new women, 19 in the House, 5 in the Senate. This produced the largest class of new women since 1992, which was the year of the woman. The total number of women is 101, with 20 senators, 78 representatives, and 3 non-voting members. What a picture. You'll see Nancy Pelosi there in purple as the queen. White males will be, this is a really interesting change. It blows my mind. When I saw this, I was totally surprised. White males will be in the minority in the House Democratic Caucus for the first time in history. Wow. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. You have 31 white females. You have African Americans, 42. You have 27 Hispanics and 11 Asians. White males total 89, and the other diverse groups represent 111 votes. So the majority of the Democratic voters in Congress come from this new majority that we're talking about. These are people that you're going to have to be working with to adopt the policies that Heather's working so diligently. Meaningful questions for the orchestra community. What steps must be taken to address the issues with diversity in your community and classical music community? How would the community benefit from successfully addressing these issues? And to what extent is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s exemplary model for setting a clear vision relevant to this community? How can we tailor Dr. King's model to the community's specific needs? At this point, I'd like to talk about the vision that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King articulated during his time here with us. August 28, 2013 will mark the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. This year also marks the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so you can see, I was talking with Polly before, and she said she was at the March on Washington and she remembers this speech. I think she said she was a few months old. And, but this is mind-boggling if you just look at how much we've accomplished in 50 years. And I was talking with Heather before, and I said, Heather, King and John Lewis and so many other people took billy clubs to the head, and look at what happened in 50 years. We have a black president twice in the United States. I don't quite understand. So the challenge is, will this community 50 years from now, will you be able to have a picture like that shows a change? Because to me, taking billy clubs to the head and being killed and tarred and feathered and hung by trees is a lot more serious than the challenges you face in this community. Incredible, incredible achievement in 50 years. speech, Dr. King demonstrated the power of a clear vision. This speech has been used by researchers at Harvard and a number of the business schools as a model business statement, as a model vision statement for business. Let's take a look at what he had to say. Can you all see that? If you don't mind, will you read it with me? Let's see what he said. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. So he said two things. First, the haves and the have-nots are going to sit down at a table and talk. That's the first thing we're going to do. And then he said, secondly, after we have that conversation, we're going to go into the desert. We're going to go into those communities where the people have been left out and where they're suffering and they're sweltering and they're isolated. And we're going to transform those deserts into oases. Sit down at a table, go into the desert. And then he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so you see that dream materialized repeatedly in this election, with the president, with the people who turned out, and with the installment of his memorial in Washington, D.C. This man had a dream that was realized. It's profound. It's absolutely profound in 50 years. And those are his children. Incredible vision. Dr. King's vivid imagery evoked powerful emotions. Even more important, his futuristic pronouncements have come true. The 2012 elections demonstrate that the change that Dr. King described in his dream. Now, what's the dream for you? When we look at national developments on the political landscape, the nation's orchestra community is struggling still to diversify its talent pool. Everything in America is moving. Every other sector is moving, leaning forward into the change. I have a dream for you. Would you like to read it with me? I have a dream that one day the sons and daughters of former slaves and the sons and daughters of former slave owners and others will be able to sit down together and play in an orchestra proportional to their representation in the larger community. I have a dream that one day deserted and abandoned communities will be transformed into oases of education and opportunity. I have a dream that all children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by their ability and acumen. This is just a draft vision statement. It's going to be for you all to work on your own vision statement, but in talking with Polly and Heather and Jessica and others, I just felt like I had to do this, because if we can model the vision statement after what Dr. King did, and I know his dream came true, I know that the dreams that you have will come true also. But just as Dr. King set forth a powerful vision for unity and justice in the I Have a Dream speech, the orchestral community must create a vision that cultivates diversity and inclusion. And then, we must link arms, go into communities, and fight for greater opportunity for the marginalized and neglected. We've got to think it up, and then we've got to get busy. I love Einstein. He's one of my favorite people. Change is certain, for sure. Albert Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I leave you with this, and I leave you with this also. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Anita, for that incredibly moving look at change that has happened, where we are now, and where we want to move forward. So as Jess mentioned, I'm going to take things now kind of internally and say, what are the implications? So we know that this change is happening. We know that there are so many demographic, socioeconomic changes, political changes that are reshaping the country, the society that we live in. So what? So what does that all mean to us? And to sort of begin things, I want to acknowledge that the discussion, the conversation of diversity and inclusion is a challenging one. It's one that we don't always want to deal with. And I know this because I've had personal experience with people who are challenged by the discussion of diversity and inclusion. Last night, I was actually at a birthday party. And as in most social gatherings in New York City, when you meet somebody you don't know, you start off by chit-chatting, and you eventually ask the person, what do you do for a living? And like in most New York City environments, there were a lot of lawyers, a lot of people who work in finance, some people who work in marketing and sales and IT. Whenever someone met me, and we started talking about what I do, I usually say, I work in corporate diversity and inclusion. And usually the response I get is this. Oh, okay. How do you know the birthday girl? That's usually the way the conversation goes, because what do you do? Corporate diversity and inclusion. How do you know the birthday girl? So people just don't know what to say about diversity and inclusion. So let me start things off by actually getting really basic here for a moment. What does diversity and inclusion actually mean? Oftentimes we use those two terms very interchangeably, diversity and inclusion. Aren't they the same things? And they're actually quite different. I like using this definition that was actually created by the president of Diversity Best Practices, and we say diversity is the mix and inclusion is making that mix work. So diversity is the mix. You look around this room, I know that easily there's quite a bit of diversity. There's gender, male, female. There's age diversity in this room. We have some baby boomers. We have some Gen Xers, and I also see a couple of millennials in this room as well. Also, I can easily tell that there's a diversity of personality in this room. There are those introverts among us, me being one of them, and I can always tell the introverts as a presenter. I always know who the introverts are, because you usually kind of sit there like this. The extroverts among you, on the other hand, you do this. And you don't even know it. You don't even realize you're telling me. But by that, I can see that that diversity is in the room. So diversity is simply the mix of what you have. And then inclusion is making that mix work. How do you get all those diverse people that are in your orchestras, that are on your staff, that is on your boards, and how do we actually get them to interact, to build teams, to work productively, to create solutions together, without turning to each other going, oh my gosh, you're so different from me, I don't know what to do with you. Because as Anita so pointedly showed, we're becoming a more diverse nation. We're becoming a more diverse, society. And we've seen the implications, sometimes the negative implications of that diversity. We see some of the strife. So how do we make that diversity actually benefit us? Because we have heard diversity and inclusion is good for an organization. Diversity and inclusion is good for creativity. Diversity and inclusion is great for productivity. But we oftentimes don't see that coming out. So let's actually think about, okay, how do we start to build that inclusion? How do we start to make that mix work? And in order to do that, I'm actually going to introduce the concept of culture. So let's think about what culture is. What is culture? And just one or two of you, if you want to just scream out, when you think about culture, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
A way of thinking.
A way of thinking. Interesting. What else?
Traditions.
Traditions, like food, music, clothing, right? Anything else that is part of culture?
Morals and ethics.
Morals and ethics, yes. Absolutely.
Expectations.
Expectations, absolutely. Now, do we all have a culture? It's your question. But does anyone in this room feel like you don't have a culture? Usually, every once in a while when I ask that question, someone does ask the question, you know, I don't know if I have a culture or not. So I'm going to introduce in just a little bit, I'm going to introduce a definition of culture that you may never have heard before. But before I do that, I'm going to show you a little video. And it's going to be a beguiling video for you. But the purpose of the video is to actually demonstrate the impact of culture. So you're going to watch a video of a man and a woman interacting with each other. And it may seem the actions of the man and the woman may seem very foreign to you. I simply want you to watch the video and simply take down in your mind what you think is happening in this video, okay? Okay. So as I mentioned, there are probably some actions in there that you've never really seen before. But describe to me, in just maybe 1 or 2 words, anybody wants to call out, well, describe to me what you just saw.
Patriarchy.
Pardon?
Patriarchy.
Dominance.
Dominance. What else?
Control.
Control. Who is being controlled?
Woman.
The woman. Why?
Male domination.
Male domination. What specifically made you see male domination and submission?
Sat higher than
He sat higher than her, right? She walked in his footsteps, right? He was wearing shoes, she was barefoot, right? He ate first, right? She ate second. So let me actually tell you, and what you guys just, the descriptions you gave me are probably what the descriptions that I get about 90–95% of the time when I do this exercise in a classroom or with other groups as well. I get a lot of submission. I get a lot of the woman was following the man was controlling the woman. But let me actually tell you what this video is based upon. So there is a small subset of islands in the South Pacific Islands that are actually matriarchal cultures. In these small island cultures, the woman and the earth are actually the 2 most sacred and revered aspects of culture. So much so that the woman is the only person holy and good enough to walk on the earth barefoot. The man must wear shoes, the woman is the only one who can be barefoot. The role of the man is primarily to protect the woman, therefore he walks in front of her to protect her from any attacks. He also must test the food first to make sure it is not poisoned. The woman is the only, because the woman and the earth are the 2 most sacred aspects of culture, the woman is the only one holy and good enough to sit on the earth directly, the man must sit in the chair, and the man must experience the prayer of the woman, so therefore he puts his hand over her head as she bows down to say her prayers, and that's how he experiences prayer. So in this situation that I just described, the roles are actually reversed from what you saw. The woman is actually the one, if anyone is in control, it's actually the woman who's in control. The man, if anything, he's the one sort of following her lead. He's the one protecting her. He's the one who may be in a slightly more submissive position. Now, for any of you who saw submission, for any of you who saw dominance with the man being dominant, I don't want you to necessarily feel bad about that. Because your perceptions and your interpretations of what you just saw were based on your culture. If you come from a primarily Western culture, like North American culture, you are going to see dominance and submission. The man being dominant, the woman being submissive. In fact, the first time I ever saw that video, I actually thought, my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, she's being treated like a dog. Because I have a dog. And my dog frequently sits next to me in that way. My dog oftentimes gets fed my scraps. And then my dog usually walks behind me. because that's what my culture has taught me about those behaviors. But obviously, the actions you just saw are from another culture. And therefore, in order to actually correctly interpret the behavior, we have to be able to step out of our own cultural lens for a moment and be able to see it from another cultural perspective. And that's the power of culture. We each assume that we all grow up, surrounded by a culture that's oftentimes invisible to us. Our culture teaches us to interpret certain values, certain behaviors in a certain way. And then, as we grow up, as we start interacting with the world, we assume that everyone else interprets those values, interprets those behaviors in the same way that I was taught. But in fact, if someone comes from a culture outside of my own, they may see things in an entirely different way. And so I'm going to introduce to you a definition of culture that you may never have actually seen before. I like to say that culture is the behavioral interpretation of how a community lives out its values in order to survive and thrive. And values are personal and group beliefs of what is right and wrong. So let me repeat that again. Culture is the behavioral interpretation of how a community lives out its values in order to survive and thrive. Two things I want to point out about that definition of culture. The first is this idea of community. We oftentimes, when we think about communities of diverse people, we think about things that are most common in our society: race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and religion. But our community can actually be almost anything that binds us together to other individuals. When I talk personally myself about my cultural identity and my community, I usually tell people I am a first-generation Korean-American immigrant, Generation Xer, working parent. Because each of those elements of my identity and my culture impact the way that I interpret the world and values. And right now, as a mother of a 2-year-old toddler, probably the working mother aspect is the thing that's going to influence most of my behaviors and most of my interpretations, because a meal nowadays means something very different than it did 2 years ago. A meal nowadays means, oh my gosh, okay, food did not end up on the floor, that was a successful meal, So we have to start looking at how we identify ourselves and how we define what diversity is by community. The second aspect of this definition of culture that's really important is this idea of behavioral interpretation. And let me give you an example to really understand. This will help you understand this behavioral interpretation. Let me give you the value of family. Let's go back 50, 60 years ago, and let's think about the value of family and what the behavioral interpretation of family looked like back in the 1950s. Any images that come to mind for you? 1950, family, what did that look like? Leave It to Beaver. What were the elements of Leave It to Beaver? Stay-at-home mom, dad went off to work. How many kids were there? 2.5, 2.3, right? Usually the family lived in the suburbs, in a nice house with a white picket fence, right? Mom was well coifted every day. She had her pearls on, she had her heels on, she had her little apron on. Dad came home at 6 o'clock, kids were washed and bathed, and they had their homework done, and I oftentimes say that I need a wife like that. But that was the interpretation of family. Whether or not that was everybody's interpretation, that was a generally accepted interpretation of family. Fast forward to 2013. What is the behavioral interpretation of family we have today? What do we see as family? You name it, anything goes, right? Single parents, traditional nuclear families, same-sex families, blended families, grandparents taking care of their children, adopted families, you name it, that's what family is. Do you think we value family any less today than we did back in the 1950s? No, right? Talk to any of those numerous different iterations of family today and ask them, do you love your family? They will probably say yes. Go back to the 1950s, you ask that nuclear kind of Leave It to Beaver family, do you love your family? They would probably say, yes, I do. But we have these two very different interpretations of family. And sometimes it's within these different interpretations that's where we have judgment. Because sometimes we're like, what, you mean your interpretation of family or of hard work or building a relationship, it doesn't look like mine, well then clearly you don't actually have that value. Think about your staff, for example. What does collaboration, or actually not collaboration, but what does respect look like? What does it mean to be respectful? Think about a baby boomer. What do you think a baby boomer normally thinks about in terms of the interpretation of respect? The archetypical baby boomer. What does respect look like for you? For those of you who are baby boomers in the room. What were you taught when you were growing up? Yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Respect the elders, right? Children are seen, not heard. That's what baby boomers heard. You learn an interpretation of respect that recognized the hierarchy. How many of you are parents of millennials or teens or kids who are tweens? What are you teaching your kids about respect? What is the interpretation you're currently teaching them?
You should have find it.
What would you say if you were to look at them and say what would you say is their interpretation of respect? Tolerance, right? And one of the ways that we teach them that tolerance is that we're all equal, we all have a voice, we all have a seat at the table, regardless of my age, regardless of my background, regardless if I agree or disagree with you, my voice is valid. Take those two interpretations in the workplace. The baby boomer who has that hierarchical interpretation of respect, that millennial who has that more kind of flat interpretation of respect, bring them together, you got an automatic clash in the workplace. That millennial says, no one's listening to me. They just keep telling me that I'm supposed to shut up and sit in a corner. The baby boomer, on the other hand, sits there going, I have this 20-year-old so-and-so who thinks he's an expert, keeps yapping away, not listening to any of us experts who've been doing this for 30 years. Totally not respectful. You both value respect, but you have a different interpretation of it. And that's the power of culture. So it's not just enough to have that diversity. It's to start saying, well, how does that diversity, how does that community, how does that identity shape the way that I see and interact with the world? And this idea of interpretation is actually called a skill that we start to build around these different cultures. Is actually a skill that we call cross-cultural competence. I'm actually going to skip over my next slide and I'll come back to it in a little bit. So cross-cultural competence. Cross-cultural competence is the ability to discern and take into account one's own and others' worldview to be able to seize opportunities, make decisions, and resolve conflict in ways that optimize cultural differences for better, longer-lasting, and more creative solutions. It's a long-winded definition, but basically what it means is to say, do I have the ability to understand how my background has shaped the way that I see the world? Do I know that? As a first-generation Korean-American immigrant, how do I see the world? And then, can I step out of that identity for a moment and say, how might someone from a very different background other than my own, baby boomer, white male, grew up in the Midwest, how might he see the world very differently from me? Can I respect that difference and then learn to navigate the differences between us so that we can actually collaborate successfully with each other? Now I'm getting a little bit of a warning so that I only have a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to fast forward just a little bit here. And I'm going to fast forward to slide. You don't see any of this. This is like not really happening. Okay. So I'm going to fast forward here to what I call the 7 dimensions of culture. So oftentimes when we start talking about culture, we start to wonder, okay, so where are these differences? If there are these different interpretations of certain core values and beliefs, where are the most significant differences? And this is one model that I like to use a lot, and I call this the 7 dimensions of culture. I'm not going to go through this in great depth, but I know that you're going to get all these materials electronically, and you'll have access to it. But what's the 7 dimensions of culture? It was developed by 2 interculturalists, Von Trompenaars and Charles Endon Turner, and they basically said these are 7 places where we see vast differences in culture that can lead to conflict if not navigated well. I'll highlight just a few of them that may come up in your organizations. The first concept is the idea of fairness. What is fair? There's an idea of universalism, which says that there's one rule of fairness and it applies to everyone equally. And then there is a particularistic worldview which says what is fair is dependent on what the circumstances are. Here's a great way of thinking about this situation. You're in a car. Your best friend is driving, and you're the passenger. You notice that your best friend is speeding. Suddenly you get pulled over by a police officer. The police officer comes over to your passenger side and asks you the question, was your friend speeding? How do you respond? I'm not going to have you guys raise your hands, but if in your mind you're thinking, well, I have to tell the officer, yes, my friend is speeding, you're a universalist. Because there's one rule of fairness. I must tell the truth regardless of who is driving. You're a universalist. For any of you who in your mind you're thinking, I probably would say, officer, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention, I was sleeping, you know, you're a particularist. Because you're thinking, well, it's my best friend, and no one got hurt, and he wasn't speeding that much. Well, then you're a particularist, because you're like, well, it all depends on the circumstances. Well, maybe if your friend was speeding a lot, you might say yes, then you're a particularist. So that's one place where people vary a lot. Another place that oftentimes comes up in the workplace very often is actually the fifth one you see up there, emotion, how we express emotion, neutral versus affective. Neutral cultures tend to be very even-keeled about how you express emotion. You're happy, you're happy. You're sad, you're sad, but you don't show that too much of that emotion. Affective cultures, on the other hand, will show the emotion that they're feeling. Very happy, very sad, you know it. If they're very sad, you avoid them because they're really sad. If they're really happy, you avoid them because they're really happy. There's a little bit of both. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that where cultures fall on these spectrums, there are patterns. Typically, generally speaking, white heterosexual baby boomer male culture veers on the left side of here. Latino and African American culture, just as an example, tend towards the right side. Male culture, left. Female culture, more right. Boomer culture, more left. Gen Xer culture, more right. And so if you take any one of these things and they start to play out on your boards, on your staff, you'll start to see these places as potential sources of conflict unless you can bridge the gap. So I'm going to just wrap up with one little quick image, and I want to ask you what you see here. What do you guys see in this picture? Some of you are laughing, so I think you see something interesting. What do you see? An old man by himself. What else do you see? Pardon? Shadows, yep. So, we see what we know is there, but our perception becomes reality. Oftentimes when we don't see it from another culture's perspective, we actually don't have all the information to come to the conclusion. So I'm giving you a little bit of a hint about how culture influences us. And hopefully we'll have more of a chance to continue this conversation. So I will turn things back to you.
Thank you, Bo and Anita, and you've given us an awful lot to talk about and think about. And so we're going to take 10 minutes to talk about the two questions that are on your tables and discuss this at your tables. The first one being, what did you hear today that might imply new actions you might take in your own orchestras? And the second, what questions do you have for our two speakers? We'll come back to you in 10 minutes. Thanks. Okay, folks, time is up. Now, the way we're going to do this, if I can interrupt you and have your undivided people in the back. Yo, hey, you guys, yeah. Your time is up. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we'd like to hear from you. And there is a microphone, and we'd like you, with your questions or comments, to step up to it. This is being videotaped, so we'd also like you to give us your name and the orchestra that you're from, and then let our speakers know either the question you have for them and or actions that you're thinking about taking back home. Okay, the floor is open.
Pulaski, I'm not with an orchestra, I'm an musician, but I know many orchestras have artistic excellence as part of their mission statement, and to be fair and seek the best, they have a blind audition process. And was just wondering what our panelists think about the blind audition process as it relates to achieving diversity.
That's a nice softball question to start off with. And let me just ask our two guests. You know what? Yes. Okay. And Anita, both blind auditions. That term familiar to you?
Yeah.
I think it's fine as long as we have a blind preparation process. And I think that's what we're missing. You know, you're assuming that all things are equal, that all people are having equal opportunity to access, to get instruments and to learn how to play and to learn the different songs and whatever and compositions, and that's just not true. And so basically you're excluding and ignoring and walking by a talent that has never been developed. So I think the real task is how do we go into communities, the real challenge, the real opportunity is how do we go into communities and identify this talent and groom it and nurture it and prepare it to participate in that blind process.
What she said. No, basically that's what I was, I was going to say the same thing is, we know that it takes a lifetime to get to that level, to even be able to be behind that screen. So what happens before they get there? And that's where the disparities are right now in our society. So that's really where you need to start looking. Sure.
Outside of music, I had an encounter with a brain surgeon about a year ago, and one of the best brain surgeons in the world, his name is Dr. Q. Dr. Q came from Mexicali, Mexico, across the United States border into California as an illegal migrant worker at the age of 15, 14, or 16. He lived in this awful trailer that, the camper that goes on trucks. They took it off the truck and put it on bricks, and they lived in it and worked in the fields of California. He went to community college. They saw that he had a propensity for math and science, and he ended up going to Berkeley and then went to Harvard Medical School. He now runs the tumor program at Johns Hopkins. I do not think playing a classical instrument is as difficult, it may be comparable to being a brain surgeon. But the point is that we have systems in the US that allow illegal migrant workers to be trained to be neurosurgeons. And I don't know if we have the same systems in place to train young people to be performers in an orchestra.
One final note. When you think about training those young children and finding that talent very early on, I want you to think beyond just access. Well, we gave them exposure. We started those programs because think about how our culture of how we actually train children to become musicians may be biased to our culture of preparation. Think about what we tell young children who have a gift for music. You must practice. If you practice and you put in the effort, the outcomes will be there. That is an entirely internal control perspective of the world. When you're talking to someone who's a Latino or an African American or someone who comes from a culture that is more oriented towards an external control focus, where the message is what will be will be. I can put in all the effort I want to, but if God doesn't will me to be a musician, to be a world-class musician, it's not going to happen. So maybe that message of an internal control preparation is not the one that's going to motivate that child who comes from a more external control. Are there other ways of motivation? I was actually talking with the USTA, the US Tennis Association, and they're dealing with the exact same issue of finding the young talent early on. And saying, how do you train a young tennis player? It's actually an amazingly similar process to training a musician. It takes a lot of hours of practice, of dedication, and you have to start saying, is the way that we train them, is the way that we identify them culturally biased in one way or another? So it's not just about the access.
That's terrific. Two wonderful insights. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
I have a question for the room.
Mark, please go to the mic so we can.
I'm curious with everyone here, is everyone's audition process strictly screened and just by the 10 best excerpts and at the last hour? I remember actually auditioning for the Florida West Coast Symphony, and I was asked to make a presentation and speak about the pieces I was playing because that was part of the job. So it seems like that, I'm just curious, maybe by a show of hands, how many people auditions for your orchestra involve more than just playing? Do you ask the players to speak? Do you look at their backgrounds? Is there more of a process in that?
Mark, let the room and the camera know who you are and where you're from.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Mark Niehaus. I'm the executive director of the Milwaukee Symphony. And I played trumpet in the orchestra for 15 years until about 4 months ago.
And show of hands to Mark's question. And Mark, want to say again?
The question was, how many people have auditions that go beyond just playing excerpts, no discussion, just that's the one we'll pick from that? I'm curious.
Higher. Good, interesting. Good.
I'm James Johnson with the Omaha Symphony. My question is, it's a two-parter, what is an orchestra's role in encouraging diversity? I think we all, from your presentation, we realize that demographics are going to work against us, our audiences are aging, our audiences are primarily white. We know we've got to get busy on this. But what is the orchestra's role? We are not educational institutions necessarily. We're not set up like conservatories, I think, might have more to say about encouraging children and educational programs, encouraging diversity in education of children. But we're not necessarily educational, it's just institutions first and foremost. So what's our role? And germane to this discussion, what's the league's role? Because I think that's, you are leaders in this area. And finally, an observation. We're talking a lot about musicians, but when we look around this room, I'm very concerned with what I'm seeing. We've done a great deal in terms of gender diversity in this field, but we are not doing anything like encouraging minorities to participate in management of orchestras. And we certainly, and I can say that in my institution, we're not doing a very good job of awards either.
So I'm going to speak more as a citizen who is a patron to various different cultural institutions. And to the first part of your question, I would say you have an incredible responsibility actually to play a part in diversity arts, because you're part of the social conversation. You exist to enrich the cultures and the societies and the communities that you live in. And so because the communities you live in are these changing beings that are diversified, that are constantly evolving, you have a responsibility to, if nothing else, respond to that change. I don't think that you could justify, if you were to say, this is who we are and this is the music we're going to play, and if you like it, you'll like it, and if you don't, you're not going to be a part of it, then the question becomes, should you be a part of the community anymore? Because the community is continuously changing. And I'm talking as a citizen now, less as a diversity professional. I would say, as a musician myself, I sang classically, was trained classically. I would say, one of the dialogues in, when you are a musician is you kind of say, can we play a more diverse pool of music? Can we constantly be looking for new challenging pieces to make it interesting? Because it's interesting, you don't want to hear all the music from one genre and just, that's it. So you are having that conversation about diversity in one aspect. What we're basically saying is now expand it to the community, to the people who play, the people who are running the institution, and so forth.
I just want to say as a preface to all my comments, in retrospect, everything that I say is out of a sense of deep appreciation and out of love and respect for who you are. It's really important for you to know that. And so that's how I move in life. I show up because I love and respect what I do, and I love and respect the people I engage with. And so that's why I'm here. And in our work, sometimes we have to go beyond our job descriptions to fill that thing, to accommodate that thing that's associated with love and respect of others. And so as orchestra executives, you have a responsibility to lead and to manage. You're at a crossroads. If you ask me, where either you're going to be bankrupt or obsolete in time. Well, all of us will be dead. But bankrupt, obsolete, or dead. And so, I'm being a little facetious, but I'm not, because I was just talking to a group, and I really thought when I was 17 that R&B was going to be around forever. I mean, my godfather is Marvin Jr. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, lead singer of the Dells. I just thought it was going to be around forever. Name me one major R&B singer today. This millennial thing is very serious. And they don't write checks. They spend money, but they don't write checks to orchestras. And they've got to be taught to do that. So you've got to go, you've got to get beyond your comfort. Look, I'm the only black partner in a law firm with 600 lawyers, for God's sake. I had to get beyond my comfort zone to join the firm. We all have to get beyond our comfort zones, what we're used to. Go into the community and build, because that's what we're supposed to do. We've been built to connect. And if out of love and respect for each other and for our humanity.
Thank you, Anita. James also asked about the league's role. I would again go back to our own ways in which we do business is a very important starting place for us. And we had on Thursday afternoon a major session with our board on leadership development challenges in the orchestra field. But we brought in 5 people who work in the area of leadership development, and none of them in orchestras. We had the immediate past chair of the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. We had a woman who worked for Building Movement, which is an association that helps leaders in the social service sector. And we had a, I can't remember all of them. Oh, we had a funder from American Express who actually worked at the New York Philharmonic before going to the American Express Foundation. So this is just to say that one of the things that we've been doing is realizing that we have to expand our own connectivity across our normal networks in order to find partners that are dealing with similar issues to us, but also come from different communities. And out of that, we think there will be greater strength. And we're going to continue to have this issue in the forefront of the league's work. And it's not really a departure. You know, coming out of our strategic plan, we talked and continue to talk a lot about community. And our understanding was that the question of diversity lived in this larger question of community. And I think now that so much has happened in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of our population and the changes happening. I mean, you know, watching the inauguration, you know, you're seeing our government, which we tend to think of as, in some respect, the establishment. And if you look at our government today, it is so much more diverse than those of us sitting in this room. And it does make you feel like we're really lagging behind where the rest of the country's going. So it's a terribly important issue. Other comments, questions? One more.
Oh, good.
I ran up to beat you, Allison. Peter Chomey from the Grand Rapids Symphony. I have a question about our committee that we have. We have a community engagement committee to help make sure that we have the voice of our increasingly diverse community. But like some advice, it feels like the progress is very slow. It's going to take a long time for the vision and dream that you talked about of having the orchestra look different. If we are getting young people of color and others to have better opportunities in education, and they're 10 years old, it's going to be a long time before we see them on the stage. So advice to encourage that committee, because some of them are a little bit frustrated that the progress seems to be a little bit slow right now.
The dream and vision, thank you for the question. You know, we just looked at a 50-year occurrence. I mean, really. So the data points to 2050, so that's 37 years from now. But look at what happened in 50 years. And I mean, I don't think Barack Obama's 50 yet. It does take time, but the point is to stick with it. Stay with it, endure. I call it the power flow, faith, love, opportunity, and will. And will is intentionality, courage, and endurance. And endurance being the most important. So go with the power flow, stick with it. The point is, it's not to, we don't expect change in a hurry, but we expect change. And if we don't do it, then I think we all suffer. Because it's in your sector, the music that you protect in the United States is so important. And so as stewards of the art, you owe it to yourselves and to the sector to make sure that it's around for another 100 and 200 years.
Thanks, Anita.
I'll just add one thing. I would also say, think beyond just representation. It doesn't have, success isn't only defined by having the orchestra, having the artist look like the community. Success can be repertoire, it could be format, it could be many other things that can have much more rapid turnaround and change. And you may have to challenge very basic things that we think about, about attending a concert. Like one thing that I know that, I am a huge advocate for classical music. I have been a patron of Carnegie Hall for, over a decade. And whenever I used to go in my 20s, people would be like, oh my God, they're so in their 20s. And I always try to bring friends along, but I know that one of the most intimidating things for a young person, or for anyone who's not familiar with the format, is the when do I clap, when don't I clap. That is incredibly intimidating. And people get shushed all the time. Can you start changing some given rules about how things should be that can make it a more welcoming environment, that can be changed rapidly? So I would encourage you to think beyond just representation.
I just want to thought, if you want someone to come in and break bread with your people in Grand Rapids, I volunteer, and I'll bring my colleague here with me and others if you'd like. But in addition to doing what you're doing, you have to have scale and sustainability. And in the civil rights movement, there were champions, and they didn't go away. Yes, we got tired of some people. Won't call any names, but I think you may think about Reverend Jackson. Take that off the videotape. He's a good friend. He's a very good friend. So, but it takes champions, and it takes people to stick with it, and it takes a platform, an architecture that supports the effort over a long time. So altruism and a good heart won't do it by itself. You have to have champions who buy into it, who show up regularly over a period of years with an architecture in place and metrics. So you got one child, and this year, 13 years down, you got two children. Because that's what we had to do in America when, with Jim Crow, we couldn't drink at the same water fountains, we couldn't go to the same schools. Look at where we are now. But incrementally just leaning forward into it and pushing that needle forward.
Thank you, Anita. We're going to have to wrap up. Allison, I know you had a question, but maybe Bo and Anita will hang on for a few minutes when we finish so you can talk. And I have a few announcements, but before I do that, why don't we say a big thank you to Bo. Okay, just a few things on the horizon before we go have our reception. The Bruno Walter Conductors Preview is happening this year. It's every 2 years this year. It's on March 13th in Jacksonville, Florida, with the Jacksonville Symphony. Any of you looking for music directors, staff conductors, or otherwise important emerging young conducting talent, be there. Also wanted to let you know, we've reached an agreement with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service for the design and implementation of a seminar on collective bargaining designed especially for symphony orchestras. The first one will be given at our conference this year in June. It will be a 2-day seminar. And George Cohen, the director of the agency, is continuing his effort to see if the AFFM and ICSOM would like to participate with us in designing this seminar, and if not, perhaps that they would work on one themselves. But in any event, the seminar is open to everybody, to musicians, to managers. It's being designed for musicians, managers, boards, anyone in orchestras. So we're looking forward to that in June. And the conference this year is June 18th to 20th in St. Louis. And we have pre-conference seminars that begin on the 16th. Okay? And I want to let you know as well that next week you'll be getting a letter from me asking for your continued help as the League attempts to build awareness about what we're doing throughout the orchestra community. And we have a notion in mind to ask you to consider someone either on your staff yourself or someone on your board who would become a liaison between the League and your orchestras, so that with some degree of regularity there would be communication between the League and your boards, which we know and believe is good for your orchestras, good for your board members, and good for the League. So that'll be coming soon. And the last thing to mention is that the DeVos Fellows are not only with us this afternoon, but will be in some of your meetings tomorrow. And we're finished. It's time to go have a drink. Thank you all.